Hello everyone, here we are to finish the series about the great video game crash of 1983. Video 1 got us through history from the start of the video game industry up until the point that the Atari 2600 was selling like gangbusters and video games had taken off in the United States. Video 2 covered the crash and the three elements that led to the crash, including the rise of personal computers that were cheap and affordable. And also, on top of being affordable, the games were easy to be copied, so a lot of people didn't have to pay for the games. Number 2 was that the competition got out of control, and there were 12 different video game consoles launched other than the Atari 2600 in the same time period, and that really confused a lot of consumers. And then finally, point number 3, where we talked about how the games themselves for the system were increasingly bad. They got worse and worse quality-wise because companies were just trying to get them done as quick as possible to get out on shelves to try to get people to buy them. All three of those things together led to a massive crash because consumers just got fed up with dealing with video games. Now, this third video is going to talk about how we recover from all that. The issue is that the crash bankrupted so many companies that were making the hardware itself, the boxes that you bought, as well as the companies that were developing the games for those boxes. It crashed so many of those companies, it bankrupted them, that for a while video games were just toxic. People didn't buy them at home, companies shut down and stopped making them. It was pretty lousy. So how do we end up with video games nowadays? Why are video games not still crashed? Well, it was largely a result of one company from Japan getting involved in video games in the United States at a much more serious level. And that company is Nintendo. Nintendo previously had made playing cards that had sold in Japan and the United States. So up till this point, you can sort of think of them through their history as almost like Bicycle or Hull or a playing card company. But they had shifted into electronics and had made a device that people liked in Japan called the Famicom, also known as the Family Computer. It sold really well in Japan and it sold really well in parts of Europe, but it never really took off in the United States. They never really tried to offer it here. And Nintendo had the bright idea that after this thing launched and after video games crashed, that they might take a shot at manufacturing this thing specifically for North America, for United States. But to do so would require some changes in how the thing looked and worked. So what we're looking at here is a picture of a Famicom, or a Nintendo Family Computer. And it looks a lot like some of the other systems we looked at in video 2. The controllers attached to the device itself and are hard plugged in. You can't remove them. The video game cartridge slots in the top. The whole thing itself is bright and colorful with that sort of maroon red and cream color. It looks playful. It kind of looks like a toy. They kind of realized, hey, video games have gotten a bad rap as being sort of a peripheral toy for children in the United States. So when we sell this thing for the North America market, we need to change the way it looks. So they made it look like this. They made it look kind of gray. They made it look very serious. They made it look like it was an entertainment system, not just a family toy, that it was going to potentially have a lot more uses than just video games. They made the controllers so that you could unplug them and store them somewhere else if you wanted to make it a little bit cleaner in your entertainment system in your home. And if you've ever used one of these before, if you ever spent any time with them, you'll know that the way that the cartridges slot in the front is instead of getting stuck on the top, they slide in and push down. This was intentionally designed to be this way so that it had the same feel as a VCR. Americans were used to VCRs, was sort of the idea that Nintendo had, and so they'll be much more likely to treat this like a VCR if we make the cartridges go in and push down like a cassette tape. But it wasn't the look and design of the box itself that was the big deal, and it's not the thing we're going to focus on that much today. What we're actually going to focus on is part 3 from the part 3 and part 2 from the previous video, where the issue was that all of these third-party companies were making games for the Atari system that Atari had no control over. There was a quote at the time from the CEO of Nintendo, Hiroshi Yamauchi, and I'm sorry if I'm mispronouncing his name, but the quote is, "Atari collapsed because they gave too much freedom to third-party developers and the market was swamped with rubbish games." If we think back, that is entirely part 3 of the last video. So Nintendo developed a plan that they would control very carefully any and all games that were going to be made for their system, the NES. Part of it is that any game sold on the system would have to have this sticker on it. It is the official Nintendo seal of quality. You've probably seen it if you've spent any time around NES cartridges. You can see it right there on this Tetris cartridge. And Nintendo mandated that if you're going to sell a game for the Nintendo, it has to pass through us first. More on that in a second, to get the Nintendo seal of quality. But they went an extra step further because they realized, hey, there's no real good way to enforce this Nintendo seal of quality thing. So we're going to make a technological invention that will force it. And this is what they developed. It's got a lot of different code names for it, but the thing we'll call it is what it is. It is a lockout chip. And we need to think about the lockout chip essentially as being two different things. One half of the lockout chip is in the cartridge. The other half of the lockout chip is in the Nintendo box itself. And when you plug game into Nintendo, those two chips have to connect to each other, and that unlocks the system. In technological terms, we call that a handshake. So the chip inside of the cartridge had to shake hands with the chip inside of the box, and if they shook hands electronically, then the system would power on and the game would play. If you didn't have that, then the game wouldn't work, the system wouldn't work, nothing about it would work. And conveniently enough, all these third-party companies that were out there developing video games, they had to buy their blank cartridges and they had to buy copies of the lockout chip directly from Nintendo. Nintendo was the only person with permission to manufacture these things, which meant that third-party companies had to develop the game that they wanted to put on Nintendo first, then they had to show Nintendo what they made, and if Nintendo liked it, they would give you the permission to buy their cartridges and sort of imprint the game on the cartridges, and they would slap that Nintendo seal of approval sticker on it when it was done. But you can imagine this setup is pretty risky. It requires that the third-party companies make the game first before they ever show it to Nintendo. That means you're going to spend a lot of money developing this thing that you may spend months of your time and thousands of dollars paying programmers to make the game. You could show it to Nintendo and Nintendo could say, no, we don't really like it that much, pass. At this point, you're out all that money and time you spent making it. You can't do anything with it. There really wasn't much competition to go to either. The Atari was in really bad shape and was barely being supported. The upstart companies that were going to compete against Nintendo early on, like Sega, weren't around yet. And so it was either Nintendo's way or the highway. So you spent all this money to develop a game just hoping that Nintendo would accept it and allow you to sell it. But if you were a third-party developer, you ran into even more problems. Because one of your solutions might be, well, if we're going to do it this way, we need to make a lot of games to help keep costs down because we can sell even more copies and make even more money. But Nintendo said no. In order to have better control over what went out on their system, every third-party company was only allowed 5 games a year. You could only sell 5 different NES games in a given calendar year. And that was a huge burden on big companies. And so one of the solutions that other companies developed, especially the bigger companies, were to create shell companies. They would split off and put a couple programmers in their own office and give them their own person and budget in charge, but they were technically different companies, even though they were beholden to, and their ownership was, a bigger company. So one of the larger companies that did this, there were lots of them, but one of them was Atari. One of the major companies that Atari spun off that was effectively a shell company was a company called Tengen, T-E-N-G-E-N. There's their logo right here. But Tengen was, by all effects, owned by Atari. It was a way for them to get around the rule saying you could only make 5 games a year for the NES. So Atari could now make 5 games, and Tengen could make 5 games for a collective of 10 games and get those approved by Nintendo. This allowed Nintendo to have enormous sway over who was allowed to make games for their device. They're the only ones selling the correct cartridge and the lockout chip, the other half of the lockout chip. They're the only ones that will grant you the seal of approval. They're the only ones that will screen everything for the system. So they have enormous power. And some of these companies argued that they have way too much power. As a matter of fact, Tengen, which is the subsidy shell company of Atari at the time, they were one of the first companies to try to buck this trend and go against it. They reverse engineered their own version of the other half of the lockout chip. And they started producing their own cartridges. If you've ever been in a used video game store and you've seen the occasional NES cartridge that is jet black and is shaped a little bit different and has that Tengen logo on it, that's because Tengen decided to make their own cartridges for the NES because they reverse engineered that chip. And the way they did it was kind of crafty. In normal situations like this, you would have to do what is called a clean room breakdown. You would have to, without looking at the other side of the chip, you would have to develop a way to unlock it on your own. Tengen didn't do that. Tengen went to the United States Copyright Office and asked for a version or the data that the United States Copyright Office had that Nintendo had filed with them in order to get control of the lockout chip, and they just read the code off that way and developed their own backup chip. They called it the Rabbit. That's just a fun piece of trivia. And as you can imagine, Nintendo was very unhappy with this. Nintendo actually took Atari to court because they knew that Tengen was essentially just Atari anyway. The lawsuit went back and forth. You can read about it on your own if you want. All of it ends up sort of coming down on Atari as well, but Atari appeals and wins. And eventually the way this spirals out of control is that Nintendo is found as essentially developing an antitrust or a monopoly strategy. That being the only ones in charge of their own cartridges and chips meant that they were being unfair to competitors. And I'm not going to get into the legal aspects of all of this. This is just to say that by having better control over the games that were on their system, by artificially limiting them and making sure that the games that sold for their system were of a certain quality, they were able to reinvent themselves, and they were able to sell the Nintendo Entertainment System in North America to great success. The NES, as we know, went on to be very, very popular, helps rescue games in North America, and leads to the world we have now, where the big three players are Microsoft, Sony, and Nintendo. But that makes the end of this story, I think, really interesting, because to date, video games remain one of the only platforms for mass media that we've talked about in this class, and will talk about in this class, that have both crashed and then recovered from a crash. Everything else we've talked about, like I mentioned in video 1, magazines have had a really slow decline that's still declining. Same with print versions of newspapers. We've seen them decline quite a bit, not so fast that we would call it a crash, but they also haven't really recovered. There hasn't been that upturn. And video games made that upturn because the NES came along, the Nintendo Entertainment System, and it was so set up differently than how Atari had treated their industry, and they were able to control it either for good or for evil, depending on how you view it. They were able to change the industry and cause an upturn that we have now. So that is kind of why we went over this story. If what makes it truly unique is that video games went through a crash, but then also recovered from that crash to be the $90 billion industry in the United States that it is currently. And with that, we have finished our tale, and you can progress on to watch our other video set, which will be about the history of social media. Goodbye and have a great week.